Well, I'm here at the Evangelical Theological Society, Evangelical Philosophical Society annual meeting, and I have with me Dr. Mike Licona, who's been a longtime friend and a great scholar. His book, The Resurrection, a New Historiographical Approach.
It's a tough word.
It's a tough word. Is really one of the landmark texts that have come out, I would say, in the last decade. It's great work, Mike. You did a really good job.
Thanks.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you're doing now in terms of your research and stuff that's going on with you?
Well, I'm pretty excited about it, actually. It started because of as a result of my debate with Bart Ehrman back in 2008, and then my debate with him in 2009. On both occasions, he raised contradictions in the Gospels as a major reason for rejecting their general historical reliability. So this didn't really bother me in terms of if there were contradictions in the Gospels. I mean, I believe in biblical inerrancy, but I also realize that biblical inerrancy is not one of the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. The resurrection is. So if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is still true, even if it turned out that some things in the Bible weren't.
Yeah.
So it didn't really bother me a whole lot, even if some contradictions existed. But it did bother a lot of Christians. I remember I was teaching a class on the resurrection, and there was this one girl at the end, and we had just finished watching and assessing my second debate with Ehrman, and she just said, "But you never really addressed his objections against the Gospels." And I said, well, it just wasn't part of my historical case for the resurrection. It was a red herring that he put out there, because despite his hesitations toward the Gospels, he still accepts the facts that I used to build my historical case. So she said, but I want to know whether these are contradictions. And she started, you could see tears in her eyes. Wow. And I asked the class, how many of this thing about potential contradictions really bothers you? And a majority of the class raised their hands. So I realized that this is something I wanted to deal with. And so I started reading through the Gospels several times in Greek to slow me down. And I started noticing more differences than I had in the past. In fact, a lot more differences than had been noted. Every time I observed a difference, I would put it in a Word document. And that document has grown to be 50 pages.
Wow, that's a lot of differences.
So I put them in categories of what I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, will call them the evangelists, because that's what scholars call them. What the evangelists were, what I thought they were doing, and in terms of liberties to account for these differences. And I thought that these would be plausible solutions, and I think they are. But I wanted to go further than that. So I started reading the ancient biographies written around the time of Jesus, because the majority of New Testament scholars, thanks to Richard Burridge initially, and also people like Charles Talbert, David Awney, and even more recently Craig Keener, shows that the majority of New Testament scholars regard the Gospels as ancient biographies. According to Greco-Roman biography, there were next to 0 Jewish biographies of that day, so they all followed Greco-Roman biography. So I started reading through these. There's like 80 to 100 written within just a couple hundred years of Jesus. And the most prolific is Plutarch. And he wrote over 60, 50 of which have survived. And so I read through all of those to understand not only how ancient biography worked, but to actually read these.
Yeah.
And as I read through those 50, I noticed that 9 of them lived at the same time. 9 of the people
that he biography.
Yeah, that he wrote biographies on lived at the same time. And so this provided me, as a historian, with a unique opportunity, because, so for example, the assassination of Julius Caesar is told in 5 different biographies by Plutarch. Excuse me. So you have the same biographer telling the same story 5 different times. And so by noticing how Plutarch tells the story of Caesar's assassination differently, we can notice the kinds of biographical liberties that Plutarch took. And he's writing around the same time as some of the Gospels are being written, and in the same language, Greek, to boot.
Wow, yeah.
So as I started to note some of these liberties that he took, I immediately started to recognize that these are the same liberties that I noticed the evangelists taking, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It says, wow. So now I can show that not only are these liberties something speculative, it goes beyond that. I can show other biographers, the most prolific biographer of Jesus' day around that time, Plutarch, that he took the same liberties that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John took same liberties that a lot of us take when recounting stories to other people.
Okay.
And so, if this is the case, then these most commonly cited differences in the Gospels that skeptics like Ehrman like to refer to as contradictions aren't contradictions after all. They're just the standard biographical liberties that ancient biographers of that day took.
That's great. That's looks like it sounds like important work. You know, a lot of folks are on the internet. They hear from the new atheists, and the claim of contradictions comes up many times. I tend to see contradictions, contradictory claims of contradiction, tend to break down in like major categories. Either someone respects what I would call robot reporting, and that's, you know, it has to be narrative, it has to be chronologically in order, it has to, you know, be perfect to the T. If one aspect of it is somehow off, that is supposedly pulling the accounts into question. Or it has to be.
By the way, modern biographies
are not
seldom do that.
Yes, exactly. But the level of that's a really good point. But the level of criticism and skepticism over the biblical texts, it seems that everybody goes through them with a pretty fine-tooth comb.
No.
So you have the question of Quirinius, for example, in Luke. You know, when was he governor, and when did the census occur, and things of that nature. The second category, I would say, is abusing the text or to force meaning. So they kind of twist the words to not mean what the author meant, but to mean something else. And the third group, for example, in that category, pushing 21st century scientific classifications onto animals that didn't exist 3,500 years ago when those things were written. That seems to be a common. Or my way or the highway is the third one. It's like there's only one interpretation for this. It's my interpretation, and therefore these things are wrong. So those are kind of the three major areas that I see a lot of mistakes being made when they're approaching this kind of understanding of the biblical texts. What would you say to a guy who's maybe just trying to engage someone in a conversation on Facebook that can't maybe go through all the detail that you've provided? How would you tell them to start approaching such an objection?
Well, I think some of the things you mentioned were good. Typically, I have just a couple answers, three answers for just the person out there who's talking to, you know, Joe Lunchbucket over lunch and, you know, or on the internet. I would point out first that let's put it in perspective, and I would point out that when the Titanic sank 100 years ago, that the eyewitnesses contradicted on one another on some peripheral details. For example, some said the ship broke in half prior to sinking. Others said no, it went down intact. Well, how do you get that wrong?
Yeah.
You know, you know, as I said yesterday when reading the paper, I mean, you're out there, it's the most horrific night of your life. You're out in the middle of the ocean. The only thing you can see is a boat that's over 800 feet long. It's all lit up and screams are coming from it. So how do you get it wrong? Some say it breaks in half and sinks. The others say, no, it goes down intact. I don't know how they got it wrong, but no one goes and concludes, therefore, that the Titanic didn't sink.
Yeah.
It just meant there was a peripheral detail that they didn't know what had happened until they discovered it in the 1980s. I can tell you that of the 50 pages, and that's 50, not 15, but 50, the 50 pages of differences that I found in the Gospels, and I'm still finding new ones. All of them are in the peripheral details. There isn't a single perceived contradiction or difference in the Gospels that are in any major details, any major details regarding the account. For example, there's a difference, was there one or were there two angels at the tomb? But no one says that the tomb was not empty.
Yeah.
So even if you couldn't account for the difference between one and two angels, and I think you can, but even if you couldn't, it's still the major thing, Jesus rose and the tomb was empty. So that's the one thing. I said, let's put it in perspective. You may lose some form of biblical inerrancy if there are contradictions in the Gospels, but you still have the truth of Christianity if Jesus rose from the dead. And I think that's the most important point we can make. A second point we can make is we have to look at the genre of the Gospels, the literary style, and that's ancient biography, and they were allowed to take liberties. And I point out a couple of those liberties, like time compression or a lack of attention to chronological detail and things like this. I point out 3 yesterday. I point out that I could give you 9 more, at least 9 more. So there's all these different liberties, and I can give examples of some of these and say, look, so these aren't contradictions, they're just biographical liberties that were taken. And then the third one, I'm trying to think what that third one is right off, and you have to distinguish between a contradiction and a difference.
Good point.
So, some things, they're differences, and they might seem that there's a tension there, but ultimately they could be reconciled through plausible, not strained, but plausible harmonization efforts. But there are certain cases when some things can't be reconciled, like the Titanic broke in half prior to the Titanic went down intact. That can't be reconciled.
Right.
That is a contradiction. And most of the things we find in the Gospels are differences. I mean, there are only maybe a handful of things between the Gospels that are potential contradictions, in my opinion, and only 1 or 2 that are, and they're, that I found that are really stubborn for me at this point, and they're all in the peripherals again.
And again, sometimes that clears itself up once you have additional details.
That's right.
To use your example of the angels at the tomb, I remember telling people, if I take my family to the movies, my mom may call me up tomorrow and say, "What'd you do?" I said, I took the kids to the movies. And then a person at work may say, "Hey, what'd you do last night?" I said, "Oh, the wife and I went to the movies." Well, those 2 things I've not lied.
Right.
But he doesn't need to know everything, about my whole family. But when I'm talking to my mom, yes, I left my wife out, but if it's implied, she would know that would include her. So you see these kinds of things. We do them all the time. And it's strange that when you start looking at biblical texts, how they require a different level of specificity or a different level of criteria in order to judge it to be true.
I think the reason for that, Lenny, is because, we believe the Bible is God's inspired word. And if God inspired it, we say there's no error in it. But this is a separate doctrine.
Yeah.
All right? This is separate from, are the Gospels historically trustworthy? We would not look at other ancient literature like the writings of Plutarch or Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio Cassius, Cicero, things like this, and say, look, there's this discrepancy in here, and therefore you just throw out everything and you can't trust anything. You might say, Plutarch isn't divinely inspired, but you wouldn't say he's historically unreliable, especially on the biographies of figures that he writes close to his own day. He gets more reliable, he should be close to it, because he has more to work with.
That's great, yeah. And also, the whole idea of collusion is, we talk with folks like Jim Wallace and guys who work in law enforcement. They say anytime they hear a testimony that matches word for word across multiple accounts, they're suspicious of it.
Right.
So it has the air of realism that the people experienced some of these things.
But again, we're looking at, I think the reason people struggle with this, both Christians and skeptics, is because of the claim that the Bible is divinely inspired. But that does lead to the question, again, it's a separate thing. Even if the Bible was not divinely inspired, it could still be historically trustworthy in terms of the gospel accounts as historically reliable biographies of Jesus. All right, but even if God did divinely inspire the scriptures, we have to ask, how did he do it? To what extent did he do it? Did he put the concept in the person's mind and then they wrote these things down? How exactly did it happen? And there's nothing in scriptures that gives us a description of this. So there's this ambiguity here, a vagueness, and I think that leaves room for considering different things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you've in the past, and this was kind of your approach in your first book, is to take the documents not as divinely inspired, but as historical records. And from the historical record, then you can move first to, did Jesus rise from the dead? And then from there, that then reflects back on the documents to say, now, because we can know Jesus rose from the dead, we can draw some conclusions from the gospel accounts that they are authoritative, that Jesus' teaching was authoritative. Matter of fact, I think in John chapter 2, when questioned by the Pharisees, what authority do you have to do these things? What his response was, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Kind of saying, I'm going to rest my authority on the fact of the resurrection. So one of the key things that I think you do that you do well is you take the documents as historical records, not as inspired, and then from
Right, I
there
don't deny their divine inspiration, but you can't, as a historian, presuppose or
it.
go on that assumption.
So if we were to just start from the same basic historical framework as you would Plutarch or Herodotus or anybody else, you can then come to the conclusion, reasonably, that Jesus rose from the dead, and then from there further extrapolate.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, if Jesus rose from the dead, a virgin birth is child's play, pun intended. It makes things such as his miracles more plausible. Apart from the resurrection, you say, well, what about all these miracles, walking on water, healing lepers, giving sight to the blind? Are these things really plausible for us to believe? But given the background knowledge that Jesus rose from the dead, and let's say his claims to being God's uniquely divine Son, well, then it makes his miracles more plausible, because we would expect God's divine Son to perform astonishing deeds and miracles, exorcisms, things like that.
Well, the other interesting thing is Jesus both quoted that the Old Testament scriptures, he taught that they were authoritative.
Yes.
And he taught that the Holy Spirit would bring to remembrance all of these things, in essence kind of sanctifying the apostolic authority in the New Testament.
I believe he did say that, but we have to be careful with this last step that you're talking about. I'm not saying we can't make it, we just have to proceed with caution. Because we can verify that Jesus performed deeds that astonished crowds and that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. Even skeptics grant that. Okay? But then when you start to get to things, I think we would also agree that he regarded the Old Testament as God's inspired word. Okay? But when we go a little further and say, quoting John and say, Jesus said the Holy Spirit will bring these things back to your recollection. That's not necessarily multiply attested. It's in the latest gospel, and so not all historians are going to accept that Jesus said that. And so you have these varying degrees of historical certainty.
I see.
So that all I'm saying is we have to distinguish between different levels of what we feel we can establish. And that last move, I think we can show that the Gospels would be expected. I mean, we would expect Jesus' eyewitnesses, those who walked with him, to pass along these reports about Jesus' miracles and teachings, and that we would have these in writing somewhere. Where are these writings if not the Gospels itself?
Well, and not only did they walk with him, but he's as the apostle, as the ones who were sent out, he actually called them to be his witnesses. So there is some level of authority, I would think.
So I'm with you on that. We just have to be that last step.
Is a little more inferred than sure. But as I would argue, as evangelicals, we have so much more data for the New Testament, and that these are more likely the first century documents there, so we can kind of trace them back to their initial sources and see that they do come from authoritative sources. That's what I call it. They have the apostolic authority imbued to them. So
it'd be hard to dispute that.
Yeah. So, good. Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about your ministry, what you're doing.
Well, after leaving the North American Mission Board last year, we brought my 501c3 Risen Jesus Inc. out of its mothballs, and we had a lot of people say, "Hey, we want to support you financially," so we formed a support team. And we were just really surprised at the number of people who were doing this. So they came, and so we're supported by donors who give some monthly, some quarterly, some a few times throughout the year, some just at end of year gift they give. And then I also have a teaching post at Houston Baptist University.
That's right, congratulations. You just started that this year.
I did, in August. It's a great university. I'm really excited about it. And so I have a unique position with them where I go on campus 2 weeks a semester. And they provide some benefits and some things that help supplement what I get with Risen Jesus. So I love the situation I'm in right now. And it allows me a lot more time to speak on other college campuses, prepare for debates, and engage in public debate, to research and write. And so it's a really good situation right now. I'm really just appreciative to our donors and to Houston Baptist University for making all this possible.
That's great, Mike. That's great. Well, you've been a great friend. You've been a great help to me. When I was preparing for my debate, you helped me out quite a bit, and that was.
And I heard you did really well. I mean,
So-
Richard Carrier is probably the toughest opponent I've ever debated, and I've debated some tough people: Bart Ehrman, Dale Martin at Yale, Elaine Pagels at Princeton. I think Carrier's been the toughest. Not that his arguments are better than these other guys. I don't think they are. But I think just the way he presents, I think he's been the toughest guy. So, and from what I've heard from others, you won the debate. So that's a great job.
Thanks.
You have a great ministry, and I wish you the best.
I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you so much.
You're
God
welcome.
bless you.